in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We are going to start talking a little bit about the NFL Draft, give you a little bit of a reaction from that, break down which teams won the day, both on the NFL side and the college football side of things, give you my favorite picks from round to round. We'll go through a ton of stuff, so we'll break all that down in the first segment. Then we'll get to some spring game reactions, a little bit of a reaction show today. We'll get some reactions from Oregon, from Colorado, from Nebraska, where Dylan Raiola really burst onto the scene. Then we will get into a little bit of a transfer portal update and all the people that have committed over the last couple of days because it was a very, very busy weekend. And then we'll finish it off with a good vibes Monday, get you guys started off on the right foot. And we'll talk about some of the best stories coming out of the NFL draft. Tons of guys that have overcome injuries, overcome some very, very intense circumstances to get to where they are today and hear their name called. So I wanted to highlight some of those stories for you all. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to have kind of a fun experience here, have a fun back and forth, maybe call me out if I didn't cover something that I probably should have. But yeah, definitely use that if you would like to ask a question or a comment. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in. We have so much to get to, and let's start with the NFL draft, the thing that was dominating the weekend for a lot of us. A lot of people, including myself, were obviously watching throughout the entire thing, and there were a lot of things that happened throughout the weekend that I really wanted to get through. Now, we'll get to the quarterbacks tomorrow, likely breaking down their situations and who I think found themselves into the best situation possible, who I think might struggle in their new situation. We'll break all that down tomorrow, so I wanted to highlight some other positions and some other things for the time being. But let's start with the wide receivers, because there is so much going on with that wide receiver class. We knew that it was remarkably talented when we came into the weekend, and that proved to be true. We had tons of guys go in the first round. The first four went exactly how you would expect. We had Marvin Harrison Jr. go first, followed by Malik Nabers, Rome Odunze, and then Brian Thomas Jr., all incredibly talented guys. Those are the top four guys that I had in this class. And then you had Xavier Worthy go 5, which was the expectation from a lot of people. So the top guys relatively went in the order you would expect, especially when the Chiefs moved up. You just felt like it was going to be Xavier Worthy. That's a Andy Reid special, so you felt like that was going to be the pick there, and that's what it ended up being. Then things got a little bit interesting from the wide receiver position, and a lot of things went a lot of different directions. So let's start with Ricky Pearsall at 31 to the 49ers, one I did not expect at all. And then you got Xavier Legette going at 32 to the Panthers, one that was a little bit surprising, especially, the Panthers trading up into the first round. I thought they might look for someone like A.D. Mitchell, who has those sure hands, who is a very good player, but at the end of the day, Xavier Legette is a fantastic player and does incredible things on the football field, and also is a Carolina kid. If you saw his interviews, you saw that he's going to fit in just fine over there in the Panther organization. So I think that'll be a great fit, but definitely was a little bit surprising to me. We got Keon Coleman right out of the start, out of the first round, going to the Bills, who had a great press conference as well. Ladd McConkey and Jalen Polk both went very, very early to the Chargers and the Patriots, respectively. But then a guy fell that way further than a lot of people expected him to. We had A.D. Mitchell waiting all the way until pick 52, when a lot of people thought he was going to be a first-round pick. Absolutely wild stuff, something that I did not expect. I thought he was going to be a first-round pick. Him being wide receiver 11 in this class is not the case, is absolutely insane to me. But at the end of the day, he was not the person that got the worst of the having to wait. Troy Franklin and Brendan Rice absolutely had to wait way longer than I expected them to wait, and way longer than they probably should have. Now, Troy Franklin did get a little bit of a break. He was supposed to go in the second day, but did not have to wait long for his name to be called on Saturday. Only, I think the second pick in the fourth round, if I'm not mistaken, right after Ja'Tavion Sanders went. But I think he was the one that, in my opinion, should have gone on the second day and is a remarkable receiver, but did not have to wait nearly as long as Brendan Rice did. Brendan Rice had to wait all the way till the seventh round until the Chargers took him. I honestly thought this was a fourth round, maybe a fifth round guy, but probably a fourth round. Even you could argue me into a third round guy because the physical ability is just off the charts. I was very, very surprised he fell as far as they did. But it worked out into the Chargers' favor because they got a really good player at a position they very much needed. We had 7 offensive tackles taken in the first round, which we talked about on Friday, 10 others taken on the second day. So this was obviously a remarkable group. There definitely were some ers and ahs added into what ended up being kind of the order that I think a lot of people expected, with Joe Alt leading them off, Olu Fashanu, Talisi Fuaga, all of those guys following up. But you had Patrick Paul from Houston going in the second round to the Dolphins. Not necessarily what I expected. A very talented kid, but definitely expected him to go a little bit later than he ended up going. And then Christian Jones went in the fifth round to the Cardinals, someone I expected to go a little bit earlier. We will talk about him a little bit later when it comes to good stories, because this kid has absolutely battled to get to where he is right now. But I like both of those picks. It was just not necessarily the order that I saw those guys going necessarily. But let's get to kind of my biggest takeaways from the weekend, and let's start with my favorite picks of the weekend. We had so many great picks throughout every round, but I thought I would give 2 per round, give you guys an idea of where my eyes kind of, burst open, where I got really wide-eyed and saw, oh my god, that guy was still on the board type of thing. So in the first round, I talked about it a little bit on Friday, and had someone else other than Quinyon Mitchell here, I believe. But I had Troy Fautanu and Quinyon Mitchell as the 2 ones here. I think these guys are remarkable talents. Troy Fautanu, getting him at 20 at the Steelers is just an absolute steal. And then Quinyon Mitchell is a dude that I think is going to be a huge piece for that Eagles back end that is getting a little bit older. Some guys will be walking out the door pretty soon, namely Darius Slay, and you're gonna have to have guys that come in right after him. They also got Cooper DeJean, which we'll get to here in a second, but very, very good pick by them, and I think someone that easily could have gone in the early teens and I wouldn't have batted an eye because this guy is just so remarkably athletic. Round 2, I talked about it. Getting Adonai Mitchell at 52 is just insane for the Colts, an absolutely great value for them. And then Enos Rakestraw Jr. At 61 to the Lions. Absolutely huge pickup. That Lions back end is going to be absolutely mean. They're going to hit people very, very hard over and over. You have Brian Branch, you have Terrion Arnold, you have Enos Rakestraw, you have Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, so many guys that are going to absolutely fly downhill and just make this for a very, very interesting dynamic in the NFC North. I think they're going to be a very, very scary defense this next year. But round 3, I thought Jalen McMillan at 92 to the Buccaneers was a fantastic pick. This is a guy that has a very, very versatile route tree and can give really, really good hands. So I think he's someone that's going to be really hard to keep off the roster, mainly just because you need to put as many guys around Baker Mayfield that are sure-handed, that can make those plays when he absolutely needs them, and Jalen McMillan is absolutely one of those guys. And then Peyton Wilson, honestly one of the best picks in the entire draft. If you were to ask me, getting him at 98 to the Steelers is just remarkable. This is a dude that can play a ton of different positions, whether you want to play linebacker, edge rusher, doesn't necessarily matter. He can do it all. He's a remarkably talented kid, and I think the Steelers, it might not be this year where he reaches his full potential, but I mean, with all the guys around him to learn from, whether it's TJ Watt or all of the linebackers that are there right now, I mean, he has plenty of resources to become the player that he can be, and that's a really, really good player for the Steelers for quite some time. But let's move on to the 4th round. Brandon Dorlus at 109 to the Falcons. Frankly, one of the few picks the Falcons I felt like did not reach for a prospect, actually got someone of real value that was a little bit further down than I thought he would be. This is a guy that can rush the passer. This is a guy that is super athletic, can do the run, or the is good against the run. I lost my words there. He's good against the run, but his real attribute is his pass rushing, is his athleticism at the line of scrimmage. So a huge pickup for the Falcons, where they definitely went after defensive tackle, but I think this is by far the best pick they made at that position. And then you had TJ Tampa at 130 to the Ravens, a very, very talented guy that definitely should have gone sooner in the draft. This is a guy that I imagine in a Ravens uniform for quite some time, making a ton of incredible plays on the back end. Didn't necessarily love the Ravens draft overall, but I thought this was a fantastic pick by them. Round five had some really good players that went earlier in round five, but definitely waited longer than I thought they should have. Cam Hart from Notre Dame was a really good corner last year. Went 140 to the Chargers, a great pickup for them. I think he's a guy that could develop into a number one cornerback at the next level, to be totally honest with you. Austin Booker, an edge rusher from Kansas, made his way to the Bears at 144. A very, very good, talented kid, a very deep rush package that can get on the field pretty early and then slowly work out some of the kinks that he does have in his game, but can become a very long time and great rusher for the Bears in the future. And then you get to round six and you get kind of the diamonds in the rough, as it were. And I think there were a number of guys that were still sitting on the board that needed to be snapped up, and Mekhi Wingo was probably at the top of that list. He went 189 to the Lions. Very, very talented kid out of LSU, a guy that might need a little bit of time to kind of get there fully in terms of a pass rush package and being the player that he can be at the NFL level. But being at the Lions gives him plenty of time to do that, and I think that's a remarkable pick by them. Will Reichert at 203 to the Vikings was another pick that I know whenever someone picks a kicker, it looks a little bit interesting, but at the end of the day, you absolutely need that position in place, and you don't want to leave it up to chance whether he wants to sign with you guys or he wants to sign with someone else in free agency. So Will Reichert is a guy that you absolutely need to get your hands on, and I expect him to be the kicker in Minnesota for quite some time, to be totally honest with you. And then the seventh round, Trey Taylor, I came in saying this is one of my favorite players in the entire draft. I think this is a safety that can absolutely fly downhill. You can work him in so many different circumstances. Not the best in coverage necessarily, but a very, very hard hitter and can definitely help in the run game a ton. So very much like that pick at 223 to the Raiders. And then finally, Jaheim Bell at 231 to the Patriots. I think this is just get an athlete in the building and then figure out where he fits later. I think it's a great piece for someone like Drake May, who sometimes can get himself into trouble. This guy will be a great bailout type receiver or tight end in this scenario, but someone that he can just kind of find wherever he is on the field and dump it off to him and let him make a play, because the after catch ability is off the charts for this kid. But that's just an idea of who kind of stood out to me round by round. But let's get to kind of the winners and losers as I see it through this draft. Now, a lot of this is kind of splitting hairs between a couple of draft picks that I didn't like or a couple of draft picks I did like. So if your team is on the losers list, don't get too mad at me. If they're on the winners list, don't get too excited, because there's definitely a lot going on here. But there are a couple of teams that really stood out to me. The Colts, honestly, are at the very top of the list. Getting Liatu Latu and Adonai Mitchell where they did is just remarkable value, and they continued on having a great class, but those two guys in particular are absolutely going to be difference makers for them this year and beyond. So huge pickup for them. The same thing with the Steelers. You got Troy Fautanu, you got Peyton Wilson, both guys that I assumed will be in Pittsburgh for quite some time, be difference makers on both sides of the ball, and just be incredible pieces for Mike Tomlin and that staff. The Chargers getting two guys at a position of need in wide receiver. They got Ladd McConkey and Brendan Rice. I think they got both of those guys a little bit under where they're valued. Obviously, Brendan Rice well under where he's valued in my eyes, but Ladd McConkey even, I think he's a first-round talent. He ended up falling to the second round, able to snap him up. I think both those guys are just absolutely great pickups. For the Eagles, getting Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean is absolutely an embarrassment of riches. I think this was probably the two best secondary players in this entire class. Now, Terrion Arnold will have a lot to say about that, but I think getting those two guys is absolutely huge for that back end going forward. And then the Commanders, I think you started with Jaden Daniels, you got your quarterback, and then you just filled up with athletes throughout the entirety of the draft. You got Mike Sandestro from Michigan. You got Ben Sinnott, who's a remarkable player that will play kind of an H-back type role. He can play fullback, tight end. He can do a lot of different things. I view him kind of as a Kyle Juszczyk type player at the next level, but he can do any number of things at the next level. So I think this was a great draft for the Commanders, just getting as much talent in the building and then figuring out how it all fits together a little bit later. For the losers, I think the Falcons kind of lead this one. Tons of reaches in this draft. Not necessarily a win now draft as I saw it. I thought the Brandon Dorless pick that we got into was a great pick. I thought Braylon Trice was a great pick. But beyond that, it felt like a lot of guys that is going to need a little bit of time to get on the field. And when you just sign Kirk Cousins to a big contract, you kind of want to win immediately. But at the end of the day, I think it could turn into a great class. Just right now, it looks a little bit fuzzy from where I'm standing. The Cowboys, in my opinion, had a relatively okay draft, but that wide receiver need, I think, was big, and they didn't address it early enough. The same thing with the running back. It felt like there were tons of guys on the board they could have used their pick for and could have been more than happy with, but they decided to kind of kick the can down the road. Now, I love the Marshawn Nealon pick. I think Tyler Guyton is going to be a good player, although it'll take him a little bit of time. But at the end of the day, I just think overall this draft, missed in a couple of places that they absolutely could have hit. And then the Jets, not a ton of picks to work with, so not nearly as mad about the Jets one as some of these other ones. I think getting Braylon Allen where they did was a huge pickup in terms of pass pro and just having that running back to go alongside Breece Hall and kind of take some of the earnest off him. But overall, it just felt like this was a relatively underwhelming draft for them. Nothing necessarily egregiously bad, but didn't necessarily have the juice that I was looking for necessarily. The Vikings, this is one where I just don't necessarily love the first round they put together. Now, I think J.J. McCarthy can be successful. I think Dallas Turner can be successful. I just think both of those guys are a little bit of a toss-up, and you kind of have to make sure that they're in the right situation to make them succeed. So I'm a little bit nervous about that. The only real pick for the Vikings that I am sure will make an impact for them in the future, or at least a long time in the future, is Will Reichard, the kicker. So not necessarily, it definitely could turn into a remarkable class for the Vikings, especially with those two top guys. I'm just not necessarily as confident that both of those guys will hit the way that maybe some Vikings fans are. And then finally, the Ravens. I thought they stretched a little bit for Nate Wiggins, in my opinion. I thought there were some other guys on the board that they could have snapped up that would have been a little bit better of fits. I think Cooper DeJean is one of those guys, but I think TJ Tampa was a great way to make up for that later in the draft. But overall, it was just kind of an underwhelming draft for the Ravens. Definitely some good picks mixed in there, but not necessarily what I expected from them this time around. But finally, let's get to college football, and let's talk about what teams in college football won the draft. And it's the team that you would expect. Michigan led everyone with 13 guys drafted. Now, they only had one guy in the first round after getting 13 guys drafted, so absolutely insane that they were able to get that much out of the talent, because at the end of the day, when you looked at that Michigan team, you saw plenty of talent. It's not necessarily that they were struggling for that by any means, but they weren't necessarily on the level of some of the teams that they were playing, not on the level of the Ohio States or Alabama. The teams that they played, there were some where they were just athletically outmatched, and they still found a way to win. So gives you an idea of the remarkable coaching that was at play, the remarkable leadership that was at play in that program, and kind of gives you an idea of the replacement that needs to be made at that program this upcoming year. You had the playoff teams fill out the top four, with Florida State being right there with the teams that they were fighting with, or the one team that they were fighting with, really, in Alabama. Georgia continues to pump guys into the NFL. 8 guys taken. You had Oregon and Penn State join them there. Now, Georgia could have had a couple other guys taken, to be totally honest with you, but some guys stuck around that will definitely pay dividends in 2024. Then you had Notre Dame and USC, two teams that frankly I expected a little bit more from last year, especially USC with Caleb Williams, but at the end of the day, got plenty of guys into the NFL draft and should be successful this next year, just especially Notre Dame in particular, but it might be an uphill battle for USC a little bit. Ohio State being at 4 is something that shows you just how many guys decided to come back. That number could have easily been up near 8 or 9, depending on how many defensive and offensive players found their way into the draft, because there were guys on that team that absolutely would have been drafted in this class, whether it's Jack Sawyer or Denzel Burke. You can go down the list. There's so many guys that would have been drafted, decided to come back, and it shows you just how important this season is for Ohio State. But the biggest winner by fairly comfortable margin in my eyes is Texas. And I think everyone kind of agrees with that. They set a school record with 11 draft picks just 2 years after getting 0 drafted. So it gives you an idea of how much Sark has absolutely flipped that program on its head, created it to what it should be, right? To the Texas that a lot of people remember, me not so much, to be totally honest with you. But I think he's brought them back to where they probably belong, at the top of college football and the top of the NFL draft year over year. And then just to give you an idea of how well he's built this roster, they lost 11 guys, they lost a ton of receivers, and they have the second highest production going into next year in the SEC. So it's not like the cupboard is empty. It's not like they're losing everyone. So just gives you an idea of what Sark has done in such a short time over there. And if he can keep the thing rolling this year, I think it's going to be really, really hard to stop going forward. But finally, let's get to kind of a conference breakdown. The Power 5 conferences absolutely dominated the day. You had the SEC obviously up top. Then the Pac-12 had a very, very good end to their tenure with 43 guys taken. Big Ten, ACC right there with 42 and 41. And then you had the Big 12 down there with 31. So definitely a great group for the Power 5 conferences. The Group of 5 struggled a little bit, and that makes total sense. There's definitely guys that it feels like that gap is growing even more and more. Another thing that pushes me more and more towards the Group of 5 playoff possibly. But at the end of the day, definitely a pretty distinct gap forming. And it's forming even more and more. But at the end of the day, as you look at this draft, it's what we've seen a lot. And we'll break down kind of how it relates to recruiting and stuff throughout the week, because there were some very interesting numbers coming out of that with, when we talk about star ratings and some people say it doesn't matter, maybe it does, and we'll get into that a little bit tomorrow. But we're going to take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the spring games. There were tons of stuff going on this weekend. We're going to zero in on Nebraska, Oregon, and Colorado. Those were the teams that really had a lot come out of their spring games that I wanted to get into, so we will break that down right after this, so stick with us.